Consider supporting Archaeo-Scope on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description. Hello and welcome back to another Archaeology Scope. This series is kind of like an inverted Questions of Doom, where rather than you sending me a question to try and answer to the best of my ability, I put a question out there for you in the form of a video to discuss, debate, comment below, add to the conversation, and hopefully together we all come away with a greater understanding of the topic at hand than one of us on our own might have achieved. And even though there are many questions of doom lined up, lots of questions in the inbox, today I simply had to talk about this topic. I've been wanting to talk about this for a couple of months, but it's been a bit too emotionally charged so far. And actually, well, you know what? This is the wrong place. Okay. This is much better. A graveyard, a much more appropriate place to talk about death. And today I'm particularly interested in our relationship with death and the dead. Modern Britain's approach to dying, and also to the people who are left behind when a loved one dies. Now, this video isn't meant to be morbid, so just bear with me. It's hopefully not going to be an upsetting video. But you may or may not know that recently I suffered a loss. Back in January, sadly, my mum passed away. And so for the past 6 months, I've been dealing with the emotional processes, grieving, the administrative processes, and the other things, the hurdles that sort of come your way when someone passes away. But also throughout that time, right from day one in fact, there's always been a little bit of an archaeologist or an anthropologist in the back of my brain who's been fascinated by some of the very real questions that have been thrown up by experiencing death at first hand in 2018 in Britain. Again, what is our relationship to death? Now, as an archaeologist, I always thought I was quite familiar with death. I was quite au fait with the issues surrounding the rituals, the needs of those who are left behind, the theory, I suppose, of death. But clearly, you're never ready for the loss of someone so close to you. And obviously there was an emotional weight that sort of hit me. But something that really struck me while I was sort of reaching out to people and passing on the news of my mum's passing was how people, even our closest friends, felt sort of quite uncomfortable talking about it. So I'd sort of call them up and say, you know, hello, I'm just calling to let you know, sadly, my mum has passed away. And you could feel them just puckering up and, okay, thank you for telling me. And they'd sort of, they would want to retreat, but obviously being British, being very polite, they wouldn't want to hang up the phone on someone who's just been bereaved. So there was this weird tension. There was a weird obligation on my part, actually, to release them back into their lives, away, as it were, from death. And even in those early days, that little cheeky anthropologist in the back of my mind couldn't help, with my closest friends and family, just observing this and maybe experimenting. So I'd sort of say, so how are things going? You know, I haven't seen you, in a couple of weeks. Did you get that thing done, that DIY project? And they'd be like, yep, thank you, yep. And you could they were desperate, as I say, to be released. And so eventually I wasn't being cruel for the sake of it. I was just sort of having a bit of dark fun, as it were, a bit of dark humour. And then they would get the joke and we'd both laugh, and then I'd say, well, thank you very much, and I'll see you soon. But it really highlighted that in the UK at the moment we simply don't do death. I actually, out of interest, I sort of Googled, started doing research on the internet, but also actually in books, grief and grieving rituals in Britain. And technically, in modern Britain, we don't have formal systems or formal markers or signifiers for the fact that we are going through that process. People have seemingly wanted to completely step back from it, and unless you're from a certain, say, an ethnic group or a particular religious persuasion, you're not going to do anything different necessarily to signify that you're mourning, for example. Now, obviously, death is as old as humanity, and in this country, for example, we've had death, for a long time. In prehistory, it's clear that death was quite possibly much clearly and intimately connected to life. Lots of the monuments that we see, for example, in the Neolithic and in the Bronze Age, the early Bronze Age, I suppose, seem to indicate that people were tending graveyards and the places of the dead, visiting those places, feasting at those places, and even bringing elements of human remains back from, say, chamber passage tombs, this kind of thing, into living spaces like homes and in the middle of settlements all the time. There was a commingling of life and death, which you certainly don't get in modern Britain. In fact, one of my earliest videos on this YouTube channel was a little sort of visual essay about a graveyard not too far from here, on the way into Newcastle, in Jesmond, where some of those graves are in a terrible state of repair. And everywhere I've lived, there've always been a certain, I suppose, a cut-off point, beyond maybe 100 years, certainly beyond that, 120 years, maybe even as early as 60 years, graves start to fall into disrepair. And maybe it's to do with living memory, maybe it's to do with how closely related the generations of a family are to the deceased. But compared to prehistory, where these places were tended for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, fairly consistently, and we can see this in the pollen that we recover from the soils. They weren't allowed to, say, return to forest and this kind of thing. That's quite a change, and I'm fascinated with that. The Romans introduced the tradition of wearing black, perhaps growing out a beard, to signify that you are mourning a recently deceased person. Through the medieval period, people would be particularly concerned with the state of their souls once they died. Purgatory was a very real crisis for many people, and poor and rich alike would be trying to ensure that people would pray for them after they died, that they would be remembered, but also that God, as it were, would be petitioned to have leniency on their soul, to try and reduce the amount of time that they'd have to be purged in purgatory before they moved on to heaven. And during that process, people would dress accordingly. They would wear black, or actually, if you were in really deep mourning, if you were maybe a very wealthy person, you might even wear white to really signify that you are removed from any manual tasks. All this life is not touching you. You are completely focused on the task of mourning the recently deceased. And that these sort of traditions continued into the Victorian period in Britain, and even relatively recently, maybe 100 years ago, people would be expected actually to express their affinity for a recently deceased person, depending on how closely related they were to them. So maybe if you are the wife of someone who's died, you would wear black for a couple of years. You may even withdraw from society entirely for a portion of time. If you worked with someone who recently deceased, you would maybe wear muted colours for 6 months or so, and so on and so forth. So my point being is that there was a lot of structure in place to help people through this time, and that seems to have largely been lost. And that seems to correlate, I'm not saying it's a causation, but it seems to correlate with an increasing obsession, certainly in modern British and, for example, American society, with youth. The old aren't really allowed to get old. They need to be bungee jumping, dyeing their hair, and 50 is the new 30, 70 is the new 50, this kind of thing. The search for eternal youth and the denial of death I would argue, is potentially not necessarily a positive thing. Of course, there are some things that are unavoidable. We had to organise a funeral, of course, and people would sort of start to help us think about that. But basically, we had to go to a funeral director, and he walked us through the process. No one that we knew in our lives knew anything about our death rituals, as it were, in Britain. People just said, yeah, go to the funeral director, they'll sort it out for you. So the reason why I laugh there is because I was so not ready for that. I literally arrived back in Wales, in my hometown, and within 2 hours of getting out of the car, I was sat in a funeral director's, having to go through and make all these very big decisions in a very sterile way. The guy was lovely, a guy called Wyn, a wonderful Welsh name. Wyn means white. A guy called Wyn helped us with that, and he was very sensitive, but it was also dispassionate. It was depersonalized. It was separate from our lives. In addition to the emotional and social realities that become apparent when someone passes away, there's also the wall, the sheer astonishing amount of administration that comes your way when someone dies. The tidal wave of individual things that we had to achieve, my brother and I in particular, but also thankfully our wives have been very supportive, to first of all let people know that Mum had passed in a formal sense, to make sure that each of these individual organisations had proof of her passing, which meant that we had to get a death certificate, which had to be okayed by a coroner, and all these individual little processes that then have to be sort of countersigned. So for example, in the case of one of the banks that we're dealing with, they have to prove that I'm me, so I have to get someone else to sign some ID so that they're saying yes, this person is him. And then on top of that, when it comes to the national level administration, we've had to contact 3 different government departments individually and often share with them precisely the same information, maybe in subtly different ways, on forms with subtly different numeric titles, you know, the E1745 or something, very Kafkaesque in that sense. And it's been quite daunting, it really has. And again, I found myself obviously just sort of doing it, getting through it, but also all the way through this process, just reflecting in the back of my mind about what that means for how society thinks about death as well. I don't think I've really had space or room properly just to sit down and reflect on my mum's passing. Actually, it was funeral, admin, and really only now are things starting to slow down a little bit, which is, I suppose, partly good. It means that my overt emotional response, I suppose, has been muted somewhat. But is that actually a good thing? Is that actually positive? And again, what does that say for our relationship with the dead? Are we neglecting death? The idea of a good death, the idea of a time set aside to mourn someone. So in this Archaeo-Scope, really what I'm curious about is whether or not we need to try and revisit death as a society, and how we might do that in a way that's accessible to everyone, the secular and the religious, those who have a pressing need to see certain documents filled out, but also those who are simply in shock at the recent passing, perhaps, of a very close and dearly loved human being. Perhaps we need to give death its space in life again, and I'm wondering how that might be achieved, and how it is that we can reasonably do that without going backwards, as it were, without reintroducing concepts such as purgatory and you know, enforcing the living to entreat a higher power on behalf of the dead, or whatever. I suppose I'm trying to walk a line between a very functional approach to grief, but also an approach that allows that space for people to reflect in whatever way they need to. Should there be prescribed routes for grief and for loved ones? Should there be formal education in some capacity in terms of what it is that you have to do when someone dies, the forms you have to fill out, the people you have to talk to, the people you don't have to talk to, or the people you don't have to inform? Should there be a generalized willingness to help people when they're not confronted with death in an imminent fashion, to think about how they might go about dealing with death when it does eventually come? Obviously, in former times, in prehistory, with the Romans, in the medieval period, with the Victorians and the Georgians, this prescribed roadmap was intimately connected to religion and to a religious sense of respecting the dead and the needs of the soul, as it were. But certainly as an archaeologist, I'm painfully aware that really funerals, all of this, even gravestones, they're actually for the living. The dead don't know it's happened, certainly not consciously, corporeally, if that's what I mean. No matter what you believe, I don't think that anyone here is aware of what's going on above ground in a literal sense. And so I can't help but wonder whether this function of society needs to be more applicable and more relevant to how we live today, but also what we need today. And crucially, perhaps how we live today needs to reflect more openly the fact that death will occur, the fact that this stuff is unavoidable. So that's the Archaeo-Scope question of the day. I know it's not a small one, it's quite a lot to think about, and I'm also aware that some of you may just be incredibly uncomfortable talking about and thinking about death. That's fine. Some of you may have strong religious or cultural things to express in the comments below, but please, no matter what we're talking about, try to keep it respectful and helpful. I really am interested in talking about a useful, compassionate and reflective way forward, a way of thinking about modern life and death in a country like Britain that's helpful. So keep the tone helpful. So thank you for watching. I will read the comments below and also respond. We'll hopefully have a bit of a conversation, and hopefully we'll come out of this with a bit of a roadmap, if only for each of us personally, in terms of how we can better serve and be served, as it were, in the context of bereavement and the dead. Because after all, one day we're going to be on both sides of this particular issue. We will both be bereaved and we will one day die. So it's something that touches us all, and I'd like to think that this sort of conversation would be helpful. As ever guys, until next time, do take care. Bye bye.